Hello, I'm Dr. Matt Taylor, coming to you from Iowa City, Iowa, right in the center of what we call the heartland of the United States. And today you get a big hair version of me because it's going to snow tonight, middle of April, who knew? But that's how I judge the weather, by how big my hair is in the beginning of the day. So what I'd like to do is first acknowledge my gratitude and sense of honor being asked by the Center for Yoga Therapy and Education Research to share some thoughts with you today, and particularly the kind invitation from Dr. Bhavanani to participate in this. And I asked him, what do you want me, some guy out in the middle of Iowa, to share regarding yoga, the effect of the pandemic, that sort of thing. And he kindly asked me to say something about yoga and pain. So that's what I'm going to do in this brief talk. And I've titled the talk, as you saw, The 4 Ps. And so the 4 Ps that I want to address today, in hopes that it gives us a different perspective or a way to sit and be and act during this period of time, unique period of history for humans. And the 4 Ps are pain, which he requested, the pandemic itself as a social event, Plexus, or the weaving or the connection and relationships between all of that, and then finally purpose. And so we'll touch on each of those today. And I need to start off with a disclaimer, because here I am, this guy out in the center of the heartland of the United States, and this will be classical yoga light, okay? I don't even begin to have any of the depth that the folks there teaching at the center have on classical yoga. It seems to be my job to interpret those teachings in language that goes out into the common culture. And I like to call that enhancing eco-literacy. That is how everything is connected, the yoke or the yoga, right? And so I'm not going to give you a bunch of terminology that are out of the classical text. I'm sure you're going to hear that, and you're going to be provided that in the other talks. But what I hope to do is just give you a little different way of holding it in our common lexicon, the way we talk about things now. And out of that, maybe ease some suffering or give you different strategies to help those you are living with right now that may be experiencing pain and suffering. So that's as the opener. And it may be helpful to give a little bit of my history. So I started out as a physiotherapist way back in 1980. Did that for the U.S. military for 8 years and worked in a burn center. So I worked with people with the most intense, horrifying, greater than 90% burns, and got to glimpse the amazing power of the human spirit to overcome such obstacles. So, through the years, then I later had a private clinic where we did both traditional physio, but then we also provided a wellness center. And that's really what we got me moving into the salutogenesis, the how do we optimize health. So they came in with an issue, we rehabbed that issue, but then how do we now move towards greater and greater health, which of course reflects very much the direction of Saitar there, right? During that period of time, interestingly, I developed chronic bad back pain. And it was a little embarrassing because that was my profession, that was my expertise. And it turns out that in the middle of the 90s, in 1996, I went to a business meeting for our health club, and they said, get yoga, it's going to get hot. Okay, so you got to understand the perspective there. I'm in at that time, Northwest Illinois, in a town of 3,500 people, county of 23,000, a lot of dairy farmers and livestock farmers, and there wasn't yoga going on. But I did find a gentleman, Jeffrey Wright, my first teacher, 15 miles away, and we got him to come in and teach yoga at our health club once a week. His style was that of the Iyengar tradition, and he never once assessed me, touched me, said anything other than the general guidelines he was giving the class. And yet 2 months later, going once a week, my back was substantially better. So that started me on this journey. Fast forward, I ended up getting a lot of yoga therapy training because I wanted to understand this. And then I was invited to start to write articles. And I thought, if I'm writing articles, I should get a degree. And so I went back and got my doctorate. And I got that at the California Institute of Integral Studies. And that, if you aren't familiar with that school in San Francisco, California, is founded on and based on the principles of Sri Aurobindo, so the integral yoga philosophy. And particularly in that, the school translated it to take the teachings, make them relevant to the culture you live in, and do it so that you elevate the whole society. This isn't about your personal redemption or enlightenment. It's about making a community contribution. And so that's what I focused my work on. And that's what my dissertation was chronic spine pain. Well, might as well study yourself to figure out what went on. And so that colors my perspective. And I've spent, since then, the last 20 years teaching around the world on pain. And so let's get jump into this a little bit and see if I can give you something that'll give you a different perspective today. So when we look at pain, the modern understanding of pain is that obviously pain and suffering are related, but not exactly the same thing. But when we talk about pain science from a conventional medical model, we now understand that pain is no longer understood to be an input, as rather it's an output, something that emerges out of our surrounding experience. And so what we've done is broaden what we understand pain to be, because typically we would think, oh, you step on a nail, there's pain, and that's what a pain is. Now we understand that pain comes across all the aspects of the human, the Panchamaya Kosha model, for instance, and so that we understand there's pain on an energetic level, there's pain on a physical level, primitive emotional level, an intellectual level, and a spiritual level, all 5 of those. And it's fascinating because now in the States, I'm on a task force for chronic pain for non-pharmacological care of chronic pain. And this task force of the 75 top stakeholders in the United States has agreed that not only is the physical and the emotional and the psychological significant and part of the pain, but they've taken it to include now the spiritual aspect, that aspect that asks, who am I, what's important, what gives me meaning and purpose. And when people are in a state or a situation where they no longer have meaning or purpose, they experience pain. And that pain is a very real pain, just as real as the bone sticking out of your forearm if you fell and broke your arm, and that needs to be addressed in order to help somebody relieve their suffering and move out of pain. So that's a big development and an important thing to understand. And what's really interesting to me is that now we've taken that pain and the Western medical science has broken it down into 5 different levels, or not levels, but 5 different ways to view it, to look at your pain. So if you're in discomfort, in pain, and again, it doesn't have to be physical, it can be emotional, it can be mental, it can be intellectual, it can be spiritual. But the pandemic has brought us to a point where whatever that level of pain is, or whatever type of pain it is, there's now 5 lenses you can look at to begin to get insight into how you might alleviate or relieve that pain. And so those 5 all happen to be E's. So there's 5 E's and there's 4 P's. Okay, pretty simple way to hold it all. And so the E's are, one, that it's an embodied experience. If you don't have a body, we're thinking you probably don't have pain. That makes sense, right? So you need a body to carry all this information. And again, this has all already been described in the yogic models, but it's fun to see us discover it now in the modern science, right? And so there's the embodiment. That's the first E. The second E then is extended. And that is that your experience of pain is influenced and it comes forward because you are able to extend your consciousness, your awareness beyond just what Dr. Dan Siegel calls your skin and your skull. And so you can get on your phone, you can talk to somebody across the country, across the world, and your awareness and your empathy can extend beyond the borders of you, and that can influence your pain. You imagine, and your joy, right? But it's the idea that our consciousness extends beyond just our borders of our physical body. So if they tell you about the birth of a wonderful new grandchild, that's wonderful, or the tragic death of a person that you hold dear. Both of those can give or create the experience of pain. So embodied and extended. And then the next one is enacted. And that is that when we're in pain or have an experience of pain, how we interact and move in our environment influences that. If we withdraw and stay out of contact with others, that has one effect. If we open up and extend and make connection with others, that has an effect. And so it's this relationship, this connection. So you see the yoga coming in here? Okay. So this experience of pain is not, again, what's just going on in here, but it's how this moves out and interacts and learns and is in relationship with others and within their environment. Okay. And so just with the social distancing, being confined indoors so much, just the relief of stepping up, maybe up on the roof or out on the porch and seeing the sunrise at dawn. It has a significant effect on our experience of comfort or discomfort. So we've got embodied, we've got extended, we've got enacted, that interaction with the environment, and then emotive. Our state of emotion has a strong effect. We know that. The groundbreaking work of Norman Cousins and how he was able to use humor and comedy and watching humorous shows to get through this extended period of pain. And by the same token, how a small pain can blow up when there's a highly stressful or what we might call negative emotions. And again, this is all described in the yoga literature, but we're excited because we found it in the Western science, or the modern science at this point. And then finally, the last one is, let me look and see, embedded. Okay, great. The fifth E, embedded. That is, your experience of pain depends on where you are embedded, where you're placed in a culture. If you're in a culture that is open and supportive and taking care of one another, that has a very different effect than if you're in one where there's a heavy-handed, authoritarian, fearful environment of scarcity and suffering. That all influences what your experience of pain is going to be. And so we've got the 5 E's, okay? And these 5 E's of pain are ways you can start to look at what's your experience of pain right now in this situation, or if you're someone you live with or you care about is having pain, are there any of those 5 E's that could be adjusted or modified? What could be done to adjust those, which is the response then, right? We see the situation, what's a compassionate, empathetic response that could be made for that. So that's a broader look of what pain is, and you can look through each of those lenses. So if you're stymied or somebody you know that is stymied, explore each of those and ask what's going on. What's going on in your body? Are you eating well? Are you getting exercise? Are you getting daylight? So important for us. And when we're in place or in house, it's important to try and get out on a porch or somewhere to get natural light. Are you being well hydrated? All those types of things are in that embodied portion, right? And then you look at the others of the enacted. How are you interacting with each other? What situations are you embedded in? How are you nurturing, or what are you taking in? Now we get to the indriyas, those inputs that we bring into ourselves. What are you taking in as far as, are you watching the news all the time? Are you talking and listening to people who are upbeat, or people who are worried and fearful, or what is it that you're consuming from that standpoint. And so we want to use that to start to frame and understand more deeply, to discern that viveka, to yogic, to look at, but from multiple lenses, just like with the asanas, how we move in the different postures. That all gives us a different perspective. Well, the 5 E's give you a different way, or those you're caring for, a different way to begin to understand, and out of that create compassionate, pain-relieving responses to that. And so that brings us, of course, to the pandemic. And the pandemic is a situation that we can frame it, we can describe it, we can understand it in a lot of different ways. And so you can use the pandemic as an understanding of, oh, here is a revelation of how indeed we are all woven together. You think about it. If this did originate in China, how it's literally made its way around the entire globe as far as we know, right? And so this is the fabric, the amazing way we are all put together. And then the fact that it's viral, and you think, the biologists can't even decide if a virus is alive or not. They put it in a mixed category, right? Because it has certain aspects of living and other aspects that fall outside of it. And yet look how it weaves and interacts with life, and how not only does that just change the life of the organism that it's invaded and all the cells within it, but then it changes how that person can interact and move and go out in society and everything else. So it's as terrible and horrific as it is, it's an amazing teaching point for how interwoven and interconnected we are. And is there something more positive we can do because of the understanding it's bringing us as to this connection or this yoking or this yoga? And the other part that it begins to break down when we talk about, those causes of suffering, the kleshas, when we look at ashmita, the individual identity, we think it's me, right? But now we know in other related science that so much of me is made up of cells that don't have my DNA, right? Tens and thousands and millions of different bacteria make up this thing called me. So is it me? Or am I, again, an enacted and woven, embodied society on a small scale that now the pandemic is showing exists on literally a global scale? The whole of life as we know it on this planet is woven together, interacting and interrelating. And that, once we see that brings home our third P, which is plexus, or complexity, okay? And so when I talk about eco-literacy and the everyday language that we're talking about, it's that basically, as a species, we've been behaving very illiterately as far as understanding and acting in a way that would signify that we understand the eco, the connectedness of all of life, the ecology, right? And so we need to enhance our eco-literacy, and this viral pandemic is giving us a graduate level lesson in the interactions, even giving us some differential equations, and we're beginning to learn what exponential equations look like, and the impact of the spread and the flattening of the curve. Who knew we were going to ever use that, right? We always, why am I learning this in high school? Now you know, okay? Because it describes the relationships, the eco, the weaving together. And the pandemic is a negative, terrible event, but it's also giving us lessons, because what if that same viral impact is a way that life spreads in other ways, as far as generosity, increased social caring, the change in programming? Because what we're finding is, in those places where people are, by their governments and by their communities, supported and held in a relationship that says, I'm only as healthy as you're healthy, and they take care of one another, we're seeing that curve reduced, and we're seeing a much smaller spike. And so the presence of this current pandemic shows us how that fabric, plexus, the interaction, the complexity, the way being together, and plexus, the textile or the woven together, again demonstrates this amazing, awe-inspiring relationship of how we are all held as one. And so can we use that then to ask the questions of what might we create next? What might we do to improve life on our planet? Because we know that this pandemic is really just a symptom of the larger environmental crisis, the climate change that we're in. Again, from a systems perspective, all of that feedback from our lack of care, our eco-illiteracy around how we care for the planet and care for one another, is going to generate more and more of the pandemics, because it brings nature, it brings us out of balance. Just as when we hear the beautiful talks from Saiter about how what we do, what we eat, how we interact affects our balance, well, that balance gets extended out to the globe as well. And so that's that complexity of that plexus, that P of the what's essential is not where each of those intersections are, the objects, but it's the relationship, it's how they relate. So how as a society are we going to begin to relate now that this has changed? The most obvious is the idea of greeting, the handshake or the elbow bump, or of course now we're seeing namaste get appropriated one more time. It always seems to happen. But when we look at that, it's really an opportunity to ask, what's the future we're going to create now that we understand that we're connected? And this should drive policy, this should drive government, this should drive community interaction, family interaction as well. Okay? And so that's not to say that it's going to generate a utopia, but how can we move from the current dystopia towards a healthier environment? Or again, what's the science of health? Salutogenesis, the theme of the entire Saiter project, right? And so that I think is one of the key things, is if we keep asking, we see something, we ask, how is it related? You know, how is my water supply related? How is my interaction with my food chain? Is my food chain, has the logistics changed with the multinational corporations? I remember years ago when we got to tour India, the devastating effect on the farmers from these multinationals coming in and wiping out their local farming sources of connection to feed their local population in order to create this big, long logistical chain around the world. Well, now we're going to have to ask ourselves, was that the right connection that we wanted? Or did it strain things in an unhealthy, unbalanced way? And do we need to make modifications on that? And I think you can guess what the answer might be on that. And so this understanding of there's pain, how the pandemic teaches and gives us new ways of looking at it, but also then in doing that, we discover this finer and finer interrelationship, the plexus, how things connect, how they're yoked, the fabric, or the we become more eco-literate as to how they're connected. And that all brings us back then, or down to our fourth P. So we talked about pain, we talked about the pandemic, we talked about the plexus, the relationships that are coming forward because of this. And so the fourth one is purpose. And the purpose really is, and this is interesting because it's kind of been the arc of my life as well, because 42 years ago, spring of 78, I met this wonderful co-ed from Iowa named Jennifer in March of that year. And I had already set up to go and investigate possibly becoming a Catholic priest and a missionary in a mission system. And so I had this idea, this calling, this avocation to deal with things on a spiritual level. Well, however you want to term it, that road changed when I met this wonderful lady who's been my wife now for 40 years and my teacher and my guru. But what that did was it gave me a glimpse that I wanted to understand or wanted to work for something of a higher purpose, right? And so that's how we define spirituality now when we look at it from a medical lens, is what does a person understand to be their purpose? What gives them meaning? What gives them a sense of connection? What gives them support when they're in need? Again, all of this is being called into place now as we see the destruction that's going on as a result of the pandemic. The economic destruction, the healthcare destruction, the break in chains of food supplies, medical supplies, geopolitical breakdown, all of that is causing each of us to stop and ask, wait, what I did a month ago all of a sudden doesn't make any sense. Or maybe it just taps us on the shoulder and says, you remember you weren't sure that made any sense? Now you know it doesn't make sense. It's not a high level of purpose. Is there a higher level of purpose that we're being called to? Because we know when a person doesn't have a well-defined sense of purpose or direction, that that leads to pain and suffering, incredible pain and suffering, and is certainly the crux of what we look at when we look at the opioid addiction or substance abuse addiction, that the places where we are able to offer people the most support go right back to what we've just discussed. It's where community is providing support, it's caring, it's offering meaningful and purposeful work for those people, it's providing for the basic necessities, takes them out of fear and threat. So you begin to see how that's all connected to these beautiful descriptions others have given so far from Cider and will be continuing to give. But if we hold it in that as that fourth P and ask, what's our purpose? Then that's what we're called, I believe right now, to examine and discuss with the people that matter in our lives. We need to talk about this. And so if there was a single prescription I would offer as a person that uses yoga, it's talk with the people you care about, what matters to them, what matters to you, how is it changed right now? Because I know in our little isolated place out here in rural Iowa, we're fortunate, we've got plenty of food, we're socially isolated but in a beautiful setting with plenty of space to go outdoors. Very privileged situation. But it also puts a demand on, okay, we're in this place, this is where we're embedded, right? How are we going to enact? How are we going to relate that gives us meaning and purpose? Because to my way of thinking, it isn't satisfying to me to just be safe. Yes, I have my son and his longtime girlfriend with us, and we're pretty safe as this goes. But it also, in this environment, let it ask us, what can I step up and contribute to ease the greater suffering beyond just our discomfort and inconvenience? But so many people, what are we going to do? How are we going to come forward as a community and as individuals? Because again, that's the work of yoga, right? It's what's our Svardhama? What are we going to do and be that has meaning and purpose? And that's, for most of us, being radically challenged right now. Even for those of us that offer a high level of what would appear to be a high level of service and caring, now all of a sudden we should all be asking, was that really the direction we needed to go? Or do we need to come back and get into our communities, into the place where we live and exist, and do things more locally versus what the rhythm and the pace of our various economies and societies had kept having this sense of extend, reach beyond? Or do we need to come back home? Do we need to come back to where we're rooted and who we are? And I don't know the answer. We need both. There's not an answer, but I think we're all being called to consider that and ask what would be the best step from here. And so as we look at that, we find ourselves right back in poor Arjuna's shoes, right? He had a task. He knew who he was supposed to be. He was struggling internally, that dialogue, right? So hopefully we're all in that dialogue, but if in this time of slowing down and closer physical quarters, within the place you're staying or reaching out to communicate to others, have these conversations. What are we going to do? What has meaning and purpose? What before was ridiculous and violating or illiterate as far as the plexus, the relationship, the eco connection of all of us together, that what was breaking the yoke of the yoga. Because and again, this is the influence of my training from the Aurobindo perspective, is I'm just not about keeping myself or trying to better or move towards health myself, but I'm only healthy if everyone else with me is healthy. And so how can I move forward from this day forward, and in what ways might that relieve pain and suffering for myself, but those I love and those on the planet? And I believe that's where we're at as a society. So I hope there's something out of the 4 P's, right? Pain, pandemic, plexus, and purpose. So those 4, but to use those 4 on your fingers there to ask and to look in multiple different ways. And so with that, I wish you good health, safety for you and those you care for and those in your community. And if I can ever be of service or support, you can reach me on the closing slide of this presentation. And to the incredible staff at Saiter and my dear beloved colleague, Dr. Ananda, thank you so much. And may we all come through this at a level of more salutogenesis to bring forward a better life for each of us. Thank you.